The movie begins with retired homicide detective Roy Freeman, who wakes up from surgery following an accident. He is now suffering from Alzheimer's disease, leaving him with no memory of his past or who he is. One day, Roy receives a call from a woman named Emily Dietz. She claims to work for a nonprofit legal advocacy group called the Clean Hands Project, which helps inmates who have been failed by the justice system. Emily asks to meet with Roy about a case he worked on 10 years ago. In the next scene, they meet at a bar. Emily explains that the case involves Isaac Samuel, a man currently on death row for the murder of Professor Joseph Wieder. Roy admits he doesn't remember anything about the case. Emily shows him a newspaper article about the crime and tells him that Isaac specifically requested to speak with Roy. Back home, Roy pulls out a box of old case files and begins sorting through them, hoping to trigger his memory. As he reviews the documents, he starts having flashbacks. The next day, he visits Isaac in prison. Isaac thanks Roy for putting him away, but insists he's about to die for a crime he didn't commit. He recounts the night of the murder, explaining that while he was at the scene, someone else arrived before him and committed the killing. He panicked and fled before he could see who it was. Roy remains skeptical, but Isaac urges him to speak with Richard Finn, a man writing a book about the case who had recently visited him. Isaac pleads with Roy to make things right before he dies. Determined to stimulate his brain, as advised by his doctor, Roy throws himself back into detective work. He visits his former partner, Jimmy Remis, and explains both his condition and the Isaac Samuel case. Roy believes Isaac might be innocent and wants to reopen the investigation. Jimmy agrees to help, though the suspicious look on his face suggests he may be hiding something. Later, Roy receives a call from Jimmy claiming he found Richard Finn, but when Roy arrives, he discovers Richard dead from what appears to be a fentanyl overdose. Roy, however, notices only one needle mark and becomes suspicious, believing Richard was not a drug user. A memory suddenly returns. Roy recalls seeing Richard at the original crime scene. Jimmy reminds Roy that Isaac's fingerprints were all over the house and that he confessed to the murder. He tells Roy to let the case go, insisting that the dead don't talk. But Roy refuses to give up, convinced that the dead do talk. They leave clues. In the next scene, Roy attends Richard's funeral where he meets Richard's brother, Eddie Finn. Roy tells him that he's investigating a case Richard had been interested in and asks about the book Isaac mentioned. Eddie takes Roy to his car and hands him a manuscript titled The Book of Mirrors. He dismisses it as nonsense, but admits that Richard never seemed like someone who would use drugs. Roy takes the book home, hoping it might contain the key to uncovering the truth. As he begins reading The Book of Mirrors, the movie visually shifts to portray the story written by Richard, narrated in Richard's own voice. The scenes follow Richard's version of the events surrounding the murder of Professor Joseph Wieder, which he claims was orchestrated by a woman named Laura Baines. The story opens at a lively party, where Richard arrives and notices Laura. She walks up to him and strikes up a casual conversation. They quickly connect and introduce themselves as Richard and Laura. Laura mentions she's attending the party with Professor Wieder, who is helping her with her thesis. Richard observes her playing with her earring and recalls reading somewhere that when a woman touches her jewelry, it often means she's flirting. Their chemistry is immediate, and the next scene cuts to them having intense and exotic sex, marking the beginning of a passionate relationship. Months later, Richard receives a phone call informing him that his father has died of a heart attack and his mother can no longer afford his room and board. Laura offers to help and arranges for Richard to meet Professor Wieder. The professor invites both of them to dinner. During the meal, Wieder explains a project he and Laura have been working on, a psychological system and a drug formula designed to treat PTSD. He even experiments on Richard, who is surprised by the effects. After dinner, Wieder shows Richard a workspace filled with books and research. Excited and intrigued, Richard agrees to assist him. Over the following days, Richard helps organize and catalog Professor Wider's research. As time goes on, he begins to notice a growing closeness between Laura and the professor. He starts to suspect that their relationship is more than just professional. One evening, Richard receives a voice message from Laura saying she'll be late because she's working with Wieder. Feeling suspicious, Richard secretly returns to the professor's house where he catches Laura and Wieder making out. Heartbroken, he goes home and keeps the discovery to himself. The next day, while working, Richard finds a manuscript titled The Mirror Effect. It's credited only to Professor Wieder, but Laura's name is scribbled on it in pen. Suddenly, Wieder enters, takes the manuscript away, and invites Richard to join him for a meal. During dinner, the professor confronts Richard about his relationship with Laura. Richard denies any involvement, but Wieder doesn't believe him and warns him to stay away from her. Later, Richard returns home to find that Laura has left. She's packed all of her belongings and disappeared. The next day, Professor Wieder is found dead, and a supposed junkie confesses to the murder. However, 1 week before the murder, Laura had visited Susan Avery, Wider's contact at the Department of Defense, to claim ownership of his research. After the professor's death, Laura vanished without a trace. Unfortunately, Richard never finished writing the Book of Mirrors, leaving the story and Roy with no closure. Determined to find more answers, Roy visits Richard's wife, Dana. She shares her perspective, describing Richard as increasingly paranoid and often yelling into the phone. One day, she secretly dialed the number he had been calling. A woman answered, and now she believes that Laura may have been involved in Richard's death, especially since he was never known to use drugs. Connecting all the dots, Roy continues his investigation and eventually tracks down Laura. He confronts her and hands over Richard's manuscript, asking her to read it. She accepts the book, and Roy walks away. The next scene begins with Roy receiving a text from Jimmy that reads, "I found Wider's caretaker. His name is Wayne Devereaux." Roy drives out to meet him. During their conversation, Wayne reveals that Professor Wieder had been developing a drug intended to cure PTSD. Wayne himself had been one of the test subjects, selected because of the trauma he suffered during the war in Iraq. Although the drug initially showed promise, its side effects were severe, and Wayne eventually stopped taking it. On the way back from the meeting, Roy asks Wayne for a ride home. As they drive, Wayne opens up about some of the strange things he experienced while staying at Wider's house, particularly that the professor had a collection of sex tapes recorded with various women. After the long drive, Wayne drops Roy off at his house. As he walks away, Wayne makes a secret phone call and says, "I'm home now." Moments later, Roy heads out to grab some food. On his way back, a truck suddenly speeds towards him, attempting to run him down. Thinking quickly, Roy pulls out his gun and fires at the vehicle, killing the driver. When he approaches the body, he's shocked to discover it's Wayne Devereaux. Roy immediately calls the police and reports the incident. The scene then jumps forward to the police station where Roy sits silently, staring at an old case file. That same day, he visits his former partner, Jimmy, and confronts him, accusing him of being involved in Professor Wider's murder. He explains that after digging through 30 years of case files, he found Jimmy's name and his former partner's linked to every one of them. Strangely, Roy's name never appears in the Wieder file, only Jimmy's. Furious and hurt, Jimmy storms off, shouting that after all their years together, Roy now accuses him of murder. Overwhelmed with guilt and confusion, Roy begins drinking heavily, ignoring his doctor's warnings. He downs bottle after bottle of whiskey until he eventually passes out. The next morning, he wakes up on the side of the road and stumbles into a nearby bar, asking the bartender for a woman named Diane, his late wife, who used to work there. The bartender gently informs him that Diane died 5 years ago. Roy asks to use the bathroom. While inside, he begins having vivid flashbacks of the original crime scene. Just then, he receives a call from Susan Avery, Professor Wider's contact at the Department of Defense. She explains that Wieder had been working on a powerful PTSD treatment, but was killed before he could finish his research. Now, a modified version of the formula has been published under Laura's name. Susan gives Roy a copy of the book and the address to Wider's house. When Roy arrives, he is hit with a strong sense of déjà vu, as if he's been there before. He picks up a metal hanger from the yard and begins digging at a specific spot in the ground. Eventually, he uncovers a bat, the same one used in the murder.
Suddenly, Laura appears, followed by Jimmy, who is holding a gun. Jimmy orders Roy to put the bat back in the hole and tells both of them to go inside. Once inside, Roy accuses Jimmy of killing Professor Wieder, but Jimmy insists he didn't. Instead, he claims that Laura killed Richard and used Wayne as his pawn. Roy counters by pointing out that Jimmy and Laura knew each other well, implying that they were both involved. As the truth begins to unravel, it becomes clear. Laura killed Richard, and Jimmy blackmailed her after discovering she had stolen Wider's research. In return for his silence, Jimmy helped frame Isaac to cover up Wider's murder. Jimmy admits that he did it all for the money. He needed it to pay for treatment for his sick wife. But one critical question still remains unanswered. Who actually killed Professor Wieder? Jimmy tries to convince Roy that Laura is a manipulator who uses people for her own gain, then walks away clean. Before he can say more, Laura suddenly shoots him. She then turns the gun on Roy, but with his last breath, Jimmy manages to fire one final shot, killing Laura. As he lies dying, Jimmy looks at Roy and says, "I did this for you, Roy," before passing away. Roy goes to the police and confesses everything. With his statement and the supporting evidence, Isaac is finally granted his freedom. Later, Roy returns home. He sits down to complete his puzzle, then walks over to the wall and pulls down an old wedding photo of him and Diane. Suddenly, a final wave of flashbacks flood his mind. He remembers a meeting with Laura at the bar where Diane used to work. During that encounter, Laura had told him that Diane was being taken advantage of by Professor Wieder. Richard didn't believe her, until she handed him a tape. When he got home and played the recording, it showed Diane having sex with Wieder. Consumed by rage, Richard went to Wider's house with a bat and beat him to death. Isaac had been there too. He witnessed the murder, but fled. Jimmy, seeing what Richard had done, decided to cover it up, pinning the crime on Isaac in order to protect his friend. Now, with all his memories returned, Roy silently picks up his gun and walks off screen. If you enjoyed this video, don't be shy to hit the like button, and if you disliked it, hit the dislike button twice just to be sure. It would be best if you watched the whole movie. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe for more videos like this.